Well, good morning and a very warm welcome to everyone who's tuned in to the day two of Mint's pre-budget roundtable conversations through livemint.com or our other social media platforms. I am Alicia Sachdev, assistant editor with Mint, and it gives me great pleasure to introduce a very eminent panel today for our very first session for this day. We're going to talk about India's consumption story, our FMCG sector. I'll quickly introduce the panel. I am joined by Naya Sagi, who is the co-founder of the Good Glam Group, Nilaya Verma, CEO, Primus Partners, Kunal Mehta, Global Director, DSM Nutrition, and Neeta Kapoor, CEO of the International Spirits and Wines Association India. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for joining us on Live Mint today. Now, we saw what happened to India's GDP, the drastic fall when discretionary spending in India crashed through the course of the pandemic. Um, Through the last 2 years, there has been a period of, upheaval, evolution, recovery, upheaval again in some ways in the FMCG space. But given that we are a nation consisting of 1 billion people, uh, demand and consumption, is the important pillar that really keeps our economy ticking. Um, Neeta, if I can start with you, we have seen several lockdowns happen now over the course of the last 2 years due to COVID 19. What that has essentially meant is that large gatherings, more or less, have not happened, or wherever they have happened with abundant caution that sort of abandon or the lack of it that people, used to go out and celebrate with and consume with perhaps has been lost over the last 2 years. To your mind, considering that there is a new wave of COVID 19 that the world is currently grappling with, the Omicron variant has created new uncertainties. Looking at all these factors, where do we stand as far as consumption is concerned? And how do you think the budget or government policy going forward, can bring some of the enthusiasm back to this sector and our consumption story?
So I'm going to add two things to this. I think it's going to be definitely, a challenge to bring back consumption. But second, it's also going to be inflation as far as the supplier end and the manufacturing end is concerned, because you are seeing double-digit inflations as we've never seen before for a very long time. So supply chains have really been disrupted. And all direct input materials are, in fact, for almost all sectors, including alcohol beverages, in double digits. So it's a combination. Sustaining of operations is going to be a challenge in addition to bringing back the consumption. So that's one point. Second point is that, at least for the alcohol bev sector, we are saying that, bring in technology, bring in home delivery, bring in e-commerce, because at least that way you'll be able to kind of keep the demand going. You will be able to follow all your social protocols as far as social distancing are concerned. A few states have heard it, but most of them are still talking about that it's politically incorrect at
Yeah.
this point of time, and I'm saying that you're playing with the citizen's life. So that's the debate that's continuously going on. So for us, home delivery and technology is going to play a role. For us, clearly, for Alcobev, it's going to be a forward looking pricing that's going to play a role, so that, like I explained, inflation is just unbearable today. Importantly, we need a national voice for the Alcobev sector. Unlike most sectors, Alcobev is a state subject. It is imperative now that we have a central voice coming in. And I hope that the budget gives some attention to the provision of a national Alcobev policy for the country that essentially takes into account ease of doing business, takes into account legislation, taxation, GST, a forward-looking pricing model. So, there's a huge list that the center can really guide the states on.
Right. So a national alco-bev policy and also support just in terms of being able to offset some of the higher operating costs that companies have had to grapple with in this time. Coming to you now, Naya, you have very wide view of how consumption has impacted our economy in the last couple of years. At the Good Glam Group, from content to commerce, you hold a bouquet of brands, as it were. So you have been able to trace how consumption's really panned out. we know that there has been some sort of resilience when it comes to the urban population wanting to spend on themselves. So wellness, health, those categories, even personal care perhaps, have been relatively resilient. But to your mind, to consolidate on the strengths that the startup ecosystem in the D2C space has been able to build, what would it take going forward from here? And again, once again, given that our semi-urban areas have still not really come out of the pandemic as properly, perhaps as some of the relatively urban areas have. What would you say to that?
So we've actually, thanks Alicia for the question. We've actually gone through a very interesting period over the last 2 years at the Good Glam Group. I mean, we've literally gone from 2020 March being pretty much zero revenues to now basically being at a GMV run rate of about 250 million, right? And I think what really helped us through this journey, I mean, of course, it was a journey of ups and downs for us as a venture, as with all sort of many D2C ventures in India. I think what we realized truly was that when you're looking at the Indian consumer and across both urban and rural, you're looking across three
Hmm.
aspects, right? You're looking at a story of awareness, because as a D2C brand, you're building out more and more awareness. You're sort of connecting with the consumer, trying to understand their latent needs, and you're building awareness of how to make choices on the new products that are hitting the market. There's a story on affordability, right? Which is, I think, where Neeta also referred to, I think, the story about how are you talking to a more
Yeah.
sort of mass market India today that's now sort of has that aspiration to buy the best products for themselves and
Yeah.
their families, right? And how that story sort of plays out with, I think, the input prices. I mean, COGS on personal care products have increased by 10 to 15% across the board, right? I mean, there were supply chain massive sort of, I think, problem
Yeah.
statements there that we were trying to solve, imports from China, and I think that entire sort of story playing out. And I think the third piece, of course, is the accessibility, right? I think urban India, thanks to sort of the way e-commerce and, of course, our partners with Nykaa, Amazon, Flipkart, and our own sort of, logistics partners like delivery, etc. That story's played out fairly well. We're still making inroads into rural, and there is so much pent up demand there. But I think the supply chain costs, as well as sort of the logistics costs, is something that I think all of us as a body are trying to solve, and work with our partners in ensuring that we get to a place where we're able to solve for the problems of awareness, access, and affordability across these three pieces. So I think on a broader level, I mean, very, very exciting times. I fully agree. I think it's gone to I want to call this out. When you talk about the government's intervention, I think what's very
Hmm.
interesting is how the government's also shaped narratives, right? If you remember last year, the entire movement around vocal for local, make in India.
Yeah.
So I think you're looking at consumers who are now actively, proactively choosing made in India brands such as ours. Right. So I think, when I look at the government, and when we look at the government as, as D2C founders, we're not just looking at them at setting the infrastructure as well as sort of the subsidies in place to make this a very viable model for us to operate, but also set the narratives in place for the consumers that we're talking to.
Right. Interesting that you brought on, Made in India and Make in India. I was looking to touch upon that a little later in the conversation, but we'll surely get back to that point. Coming to you now, Kunal, you have been in the food space for many years now, and you've sort of had that outside-in view of, India as a consumption market as well. How have how have things how have the events over the course of the last 2 years impacted this space? How much have we been able to recover? Our demand for essentials, of course, was fairly resilient, but we there had been a dip across the board. As we look to the budget now, to fuel demand, whether it's tax ops for the salaried class, whether it's making whether it's making more cash available to business persons, what can be done so that consumption again revives in the space?
Yeah, thank you for the question, Alicia. And I think you said it. Thankfully, I've been away from India for a few years, so I have this overview of the pandemic, what's happening in the country, but also happening outside across the world.
Yeah.
Now, some of the challenges that India has been facing is pretty similar across the world. Supply chain logistics, it's been a nightmare across. Raw material and COGS increase, it's again been a big problem. But then when you start getting into India, there are some specific challenges that India has. We have this strong rural urban divide, which is very specific to India. We're talking of about 70% population still residing in the rural areas, but only contributing to 45% to the overall FMCG revenues. Now, there is no doubt that that if we can revive that part of the business, the FMCG sector can come back. But the challenge always comes back to the two A's that I always say in India. That's the challenge: accessibility and availability. And for that, it is extremely important for the government to look at the FMCG space as an ecosystem, not only just the consumer and the FMCG player, but the entire value chain. There are
Mhm.
supply partners, there are ingredient suppliers, there are packaging manufacturers, the logistics itself. How do you start, giving stimulus, giving subsidies to different players in that entire ecosystem to ensure that there is consumption that starts coming back? You mentioned tax. Now, the one of the things that the government should be looking at is that what is it that can be done in terms of the standard tax deduction? Can we for some time increase that standard deduction to provide more disposable income in the hands of the consumer? And will that then help in reviving the consumer demand? I think there is clearly a pent up demand, but there is not enough money in the hands at the moment. There is a need, people want to buy, but they're holding back. So there are these things about how you start looking at what are the possibilities. I think one other thing you touched upon is essential. That's an interesting element that's been taking place in the last 2 years. This whole awareness about going for healthy choices, going for immunity boosting choices is on the rise. Now, once again, it is for the government to say that, you know what, if we want to reduce our healthcare, we need to work with FMCG manufacturers and provide them subsidies on innovations that actually help in boosting those immunity measures. So it's a combination of all of that, which will ensure that we see that consumption coming back. Because I think otherwise, it's a downward cycle. We have to kind of hold it right now, and the government has to play a big role in that.
Fair enough. Let me take that question now to you, Nilaya. We've spoken about, I mean, how Kunal pointed out that although 70% of our population is, residing within the rural regions, the consumption piece that comes from there or the demand that comes, for the FMCG sector from the rural areas is only about 45%. The government itself has, agendas like doubling farm income, as one of their key focus areas. What are the specific actions that can be taken at this point in time to really introduce that virtuous cycle in the rural economy as well, so that there's more cash in hand, more disposable income, so to say, to spend in the rural consumption areas particularly.
Thanks, Alicia. I think it's a very important question. And I say that because if you just look at rural demand, if you look at rural consumption for the quarter which ended last year, September, on a year to year basis, rural consumption grew by 58%, which is twice that of the urban area. And that's really where the demand is. I also want to make a point that look at migration that is happening. And if you just look at government's own data on a scene portal, there are 10% less people coming to urban areas. And that's really where the broader FMCG market is going to grow. And I think here we need to look at both short term and long term measures. One would be the allocation this year the budget has on MNREGA. We need to understand that last year, because let's just look at
Yeah.
what's driving money into into people's pocket. Even South states, which typically never used to use a lot of MNREGA, have used a huge amount of money, which basically indicates the stress that people have. So I'm going to look forward to how that in the short term, the government supports that, because that directly drives consumption for FMCG. I think the second part that would be important, which is medium to long term, is the entire digital infrastructure that the government is going to roll out or has announced to roll out, whether you're talking about the BharatNet and other programs, because eventually they lead to better opportunities, and better opportunity leads to better jobs and incomes, including for what you talked about, the farm income, etc. We do need that rural digital infrastructure to make that happen. But if I can come back at an overall level, Alicia, budgets is all about sentiments, and
Yeah.
consume and FMCG is about consumer sentiments. So as long as the budget can impact the sentiment for a, and I increasingly look at people who earn 20,000 to 1 lakh rupees a month as the core of where the market is, not the other one, because they tend to
Right.
it's if they feel confident of the future, we will have spent. I don't think direct government is in a position, given the fiscal deficit and the needs of every other industry, to provide any additional incentives, but the sentiment becomes very important. And if you allow me to make one large last point, I think um, the in rural income is also a function of how much government is spending and where the government has a direct load on infrastructure build out, because that's where
Right.
a lot of those things are happening. So I would look at FMCG growth not directly but indirectly, for it to really happen.
Right. And that's an interesting lens, really, to look at it with. But you touched upon two very important, points of conversation. Also, the digital infrastructure and digital economy, which is fairly untapped and still, and the fact that the fiscal space available to governments to really give sort of cash handouts of sorts, that exhausted a while back anyway. So there perhaps is very limited headroom that very direct sort of subsidization or fiscal support can come through. Coming to you, Naya, please share with us any more insights that you have about the key demographic that you operate in, which I do believe is the demographic that Naya also spoke of. How have you seen consumption patterns pan out over there? We have seen that with people relatively at the bottom levels of the pyramid, this pandemic was a much harsher time, and that is where the mass market really is situated. Um, how have you seen that market perform? And going forward, what can we do to strengthen sentiment, that very unquantifiable, will o' the wisp, effervescent sort of phenomenon that everyone talks about? It's very hard to sort of pin it down to any one thing that can really boost it. But to your mind, what could those things be?
So, I think I really appreciate the points Nalaya made, because I think I resonated a lot with them and what we're seeing play out as well. When we look at at a group level, and just to sort of share with everyone, we're basically, we're a big believer in the whole journey of content to commerce, right? As a
Yeah.
group, and every month we're touching more than 3 billion impressions. We're one of the largest content companies as well, right? And I think the reason we are such believers in content, and sort of the narrative that content sort of plays out, is because for us it's not so much a story of which regions we are operating in. So there's no sort of urban rural divide in our heads. It's more about who in any region across India would basically be able to resonate with the content that's sort of being shared with them, or the content that they're actually co-creating with us, right? I think that is sort of the big sort of just I think just lens I would like to sort of share, because for us, when we look across the demographics, while we might have a large segment of our audiences coming in from tier 2, tier 3, tier 4 towns and cities, it's I think content basically cuts across, thanks to sort of the way digital has rolled out across India today. Now, what does that mean for us? It basically means, and I think the way we're seeing it play out is, today most of our products are priced at mass to mass premium pricing, right? We
Hmm.
are, however, seeing a very strong pent up demand and a very strong requirement coming from so called rural areas, because what we're realizing again is, it's not a story of urban versus rural alone, it's a story of where pockets of income lie. Right. And even in rural areas where they have access to the internet, where these conversations are happening around better care, be it hair care, skin care, personal care, baby care, as the case may be,
Yeah.
and all those sort of related demands. That is where sort of our audiences find us, and that's where our audiences need us, right? So that is, I think, one large part of the story. I think, again, as a group, we don't distinguish between urban, rural. We talk about where our consumer is. The second thing, of course, as a group, is about 80% of our products today, the majority of our products are focused on women, right? And if you look at the way
Yeah.
women are now consuming content, as well as women making household consumption decisions, you've also seen, like, for us at Baby Chakra, we work with mothers, right? So when you look at NFHS data, women, married women making household consumption, FMCG consumption choices has moved up from 83% to 89% in the last 2 years alone, which is a massive shift if you think about it, right? And our belief in what is driving that shift is the fact that now women are feeling more empowered to make choices because of the content that is coming their way, right? So I think that's the second piece that we are really focused on, and how to get more and more women feel more empowered to make choices around FMCG decisions, and the products that they use in their families and themselves.
And to that specific point, how do you think the government, perhaps if not through the budget but through other measures, can play an active role in that? And once again, if you could address the demographic that we spoke of, in the salaried class, but people perhaps who would have not had very steady, stable incomes. When pandemics have taken place, there have been widespread job losses. Even the youth has gone through a massive cycle of job losses, where they aren't affiliated to a salaried sort of a job or an institution that can provide them that cushion to fall back on. Do they cut back on discretionary spending when that happens, and what can be done to bring that back?
So, I mean, absolutely. I think there is obviously a cut that we've seen. And I think, but very interesting if you actually look at the data, right? I mean, and from my understanding and what we've seen play out in the group as well, I think we've seen a growth in the top lines. I think a very, very clear growth in the top lines in terms of in our product portfolio sales, right? And certainly, I think as at an industry level, when we talk to other D2C founders, people have all sort of reported very strong growth curves over the last quarter and a half, right? With sort of the sentiment coming back. I think that sentiment term is extremely important when you think about, like, discretionary spending. But I do think that, I think with the I think the big question before us is about how do you sort of make it even more affordable, right? And I think it comes back to saying that as an industry, we're sort of seeing our bottom lines getting quite badly hit, right? Because again, of our cogs and
Yeah.
logistics
Yeah.
costs, right? So I think as long as we can address that constantly, and I think a lot of that will come from, okay, we are sourcing from India, and we are investing in the Make in India initiatives, right? How do we sort of get the benefit of all these investments, right? That's one piece to it.
Hmm.
The second is, how do you sort of decrease your CAC, right? One of the biggest problems on D2C is the cost of customer acquisition, right? I mean, we've obviously been able to solve for that very, very substantially. We have the lowest CAC in the industry because of our content reach and
Yeah.
engagement. But I think, again, sort of getting digital in the hands of more and more new consumers is something we're looking to the government to do. I think Geo spurred one revolution. I think we're looking to the government to basically take stories like that forward, right? And reduce the cost of smartphones, reduce the cost of data, or help sort of companies that are looking at data democracy, and like sort of helping them grow out the base further for us all to benefit together.
Right, absolutely. And those are, in fact, the larger pillars of growth also that, the country needs to work towards. Neeta, if I can come to you now, you mentioned that although GST, of course, lies outside of the purview of the budget, strictly speaking, but it can give a sort of, the budget itself can give a sort of a guidance, to where, we might expect policy making to head or policy to head. When it comes to, the liquor space, which has, like you said, remained outside of the GST umbrella, it is largely a state subject. How does that impact the ease of doing business for you, especially at a time when raw material costs, have been going up as much as they have? I mean, we've seen, input costs rise because of many, many reasons. Freight rates going up, 200 times, 300 times, is just one of them. How do you see that, bringing liquor into the GST umbrella? Is that an ask, from the association, from the industry that you represent? And if not that particular, demand that can be addressed, what are some of the other things that the government can do, to help your lives?
So you hit the nail on the head. I'll just give you some perspective. The alcobev, the liquor alcohol industry, collectively contributes to over $20 billion in taxes, right? We have two masters. We have the 28 plus 4 union territories as one set of masters, and then we have the central government as another set of master, because the custom duty is related to the center. That's one. Second is that the alcobev industry is actually a very strong influencer to tourism, very strong influencer to hospitality, entertainment, and so the ecosystem around alcobev really contributes significantly to the exchequer, both at the state and the central level. Almost all our direct materials are GST other than ENA, because ENA is currently under VAT and it's a state subject. And yes, as an association, we would welcome the shift to happen to ENA and GST, albeit from a prospective point of view at a revenue neutral rate that we would be seeking. So that was on the GST front. The third point is really when we are looking at, so you can understand that if I have two masters, each master has its own demands. Therefore, you can have an idea about what is happening on ease of doing business, right? I think I had earlier on in a session applauded the Prime Minister when he said that the government has no business to be in business, right?
Yeah.
I was in fact looking for some significant changes. But in our sector, in my sector, the government is in business every which way of the business, right from the production to the delivery. And there are times when we are telling the government, at least given the inflation, at least have a forward looking pricing model. See, what happens is in FMCG, you calibrate your prices, and then you see the affordability and accessibility of the consumers, like the other panel members have said, and you calibrate it and you kind of keep your margins to an acceptable threshold level at your end. But in a liquor industry or alcobev, we are dependent on the state to give us pricing. Each state will have his or her own idiosyncrasy. Somebody will say, give me all India lowest, but you're for always backward looking. You are not looking at a forward pricing. So pricing, inflation adjustment, an economic model, ease of doing business, automation, simple licensing, label registration. So that's why I started by saying that, India needs a national alcobev policy. That's a guideline for all the states, not just for alcobev, but for tourism and all the allied sectors for alcobev, around the alcobev. So these are some of the suggestions, but pricing is a big bane, is one of the biggest pain points that all of us are facing today.
Right. So you're recommending that the government really walk the talk on minimizing government and maximizing governance, and perhaps get a step away a little bit from the business of doing business.
And the second
Kunal,
thing, actually,
yes,
I'm going
please.
to interrupt you. And the second thing, very recently, actually, the Commerce Minister, when they launched the UK FTA, said, and this is
Yes,
where I keep talking in various forums again to say, Atmanirbharta is not about closing doors. Atmanirbharta is not about becoming insular. And I'm glad that the Commerce Minister, in fact, reaffirmed to say, Atmanirbharta is about opening India's doors wider to be able to make India more resilient. Whereas I often find people taking a very, very linear view about made in India. And that's another struggle that, we have in the Alcobev to say, we are all 99% Indian producers. Where is this differentiation coming from? So that's the
absolutely.
second point that is adjusted to the earlier comment I made, which is the government really has no business to be in business.
Well, that's a very sharp commentary coming in from you, and I hope that it registers with the people it needs to register with. Um,
Thank you.
Kunal, once again, as every member on this panel has pointed out, that input costs input cost inflation has been a big concern with FMCG, as with every other sector in the economy. It's one thing we constantly hear, through various earnings calls that we may attend. So we know that it is a pain point, and it has been for some time. It's also a global phenomenon. But what happens in the case of India, particularly, is that it ends up pinching the consumers at the bottom of the
Sure.
pyramid a lot more. Whether it's cooking oil, whether it's, the price of cereals, when everything goes up, there's only so much that household consumption can be reduced. But there certainly may be an impact that would have happened. What can be done at this point to sort of arrest, I mean, the global phenomenon, of course, will take its time to play out. But what can be done by way of some sort of support from the government side to cushion some of these rising prices,
Yeah.
and just perhaps protect the consumers at the bottom of the pyramid a little bit more.
Yeah, I think Nila said this, that the government has done what it can do, but I think that there is always an opportunity, because I think it's not a question of what they've given already. It's a question of what are the possibilities and how it reflects in cash coming back to them. And what I'm trying to say is that, I started off by saying accessibility and availability. Now, what does accessibility and availability mean? One of the challenges that the FMCG company is facing because of input cost is the logistics cost. So there is also this
Yeah.
logistics across the entire chain. Now, can there be a freight or subsidy given in the freight cost in some form or the other? Because what happens is that, as you all understand, in the Indian market, in the FMCG, you cannot increase prices for products and SKUs which are sub 20 levels. And if you're talking about semi-urban and rural, if you do not, as an FMCG player, do not have the leeway to increase pricing there, which is the large chunk of your top line and as well as bottom line, you need those benefits to come from the government. So I would say the subsidy in freight cost would be one thing. The second thing is that I think there can be a bit of a leeway in the production targets that have been set up in the production linked incentive scheme. We know that the last 2 years production in the factories is not happening in the same way that it was
Yeah.
happening, and it's a circle. You don't have enough labor wage costs have gone up, logistics costs have gone up, there is not enough demand in the market, so it goes on like that. So if you cannot meet those production targets, how do you even get those incentives? So I think that's another place where the government has to look into that. And it's not really doling out more cash at this moment, it's just saying that we are going to reduce the the incentive structure that we had laid out so that you can reduce your production target but still avail those benefits that we had promised to you some time back. The other thing is that the corporate tax needs to be maintained if it cannot be reduced. This is not the time to be looking at the corporate tax, and I think that's another favorite place the government likes to look at, that's a nice way to get money back. But I think right now, if you do that, you're actually hurting the backs of the FMCG players as well as the consumers, because after a point in time, the FMCG players will start rising the prices of their products, and the consumer who's already holding back will further push back, and that's not going to help the economy. So these are some of the things that can help, directly or indirectly, the different players in the entire chain.
Right.
Yeah.
Nilaya, I want to put the same question to you. You know, Customers again at the bottom of the pyramid have been impacted, very, very deeply by a myriad of cost increases that they have had to contend with, whether it's fuel, whether it's, like I said, cooking oil. Lots of these price increases have meant that there have to be cutbacks that they will have to make somewhere or the other. And more often than not, it will be on discretionary spending. What can be done? Once again, the question, of course, is, the idea of this conversation is to try and figure out some actionable inputs, that the government can also look to, address through the budget document, of course, and also through the rest of the year. To your mind, what are some specific, arrangements that can be made? Whether it's through, extending, perhaps we do have the ECLGS scheme, which the government may extend. Some more provisions like that, perhaps that can help.
Yeah, Alicia, I think Kunal mentioned quite a few of them, and I completely agree with him. I think one of the biggest challenge that we're going to see over the next few months is I think, additional increase in the input cost. Oil is at
Yeah.
$88. It's not going to come down. If at all, it's people are talking about it going to 100. I think it was mentioned that the top line for FMCG companies have grown, but the profitability
Yeah.
has got hit, and you can't pass that on continuously. So I true believe government has to look at equalizing some of the freight subsidy or bringing in that, because it cannot be passed on. And I also think it's good for the government to consider, because over the last 1 year, the indirect tax revenue have tend to become the mainstay as far as the government is concerned. And that
Yeah.
essentially is about consumption. I do believe government is formalizing more and more the economy, wherein the integration is happening. A lot of the FMCG sector, as was mentioned by my panelists, ITC is there across, so therefore there is much better transparency. So I do believe a GST rationalization is should be happening for this sector. Now clearly budget doesn't announce that, but it can
Yeah.
clearly give an indication, because investment plans and many other things have to be done about it. I also think a government for certain sectors has to drive has to bring in money or direct money for consumption. Without that, we can't do it, because all the other efforts that I spoke about, others people spoke about, will take time. But the next quarter or the next 6 months is going to be very, very important for the uptick in the economy to continue, especially the pressure that we have of inflation.
Nilay, I'm just going
Right.
to add one thing.
Yeah.
Sorry, just adding one point is I haven't heard much about job creation. Given that 70 to 80% of our economy is informal, and that has what's got affected during the last 2.5 years
Absolutely.
around that. So there isn't any thought around or discussions around, job creation. We are the lowest at this point of time, a decadal lowest, if you look at the
That's
CMI reports.
yeah. If I can,
So,
sorry.
sorry. No, no,
No,
carry
no.
on.
I think you're absolutely right. In fact, when we talk about sentiment, what government is going to announce for job creation is going to be critical.
Yeah.
I do believe when you formalize the economy, the first sector which gets impacted is the informal sector, or what we refer to MSMEs, and therefore
Yeah.
how government is going to incentivize that sector, especially in their journey for digitization. And
Yeah.
digitalization is going to be an extremely important initiative, because credit isn't going enough. And now that's a much larger, bigger point. But I think those are important, because end of the day, as we talked about, we are a consumption economy, and consumption economy grows in terms of income that people have at the bottom of the pyramid.
Very true.
Absolutely. Naya, I want to bring you in here. How do you look at this whole conversation around rationalizing GST? The segments that you also operate in, the personal care space, the beauty space, are placed, in the higher tax brackets when it comes to GST. Your input costs have been rising as much as they have. Um, you have had to pass on most of that, I would believe, to the customers as well, which results in, like you said, top lines improving, but then profitability remains a key concern, doesn't it? And for other D2C players as well, I would imagine this is a concern. Um, are you looking at some sort of tax rationalization in these categories, or some sort of, support on input costs that should help?
I mean, I think all the other panelists have actually talked about this a fair bit already. I think as a sector as well, and I think especially, if you were to sort of categorize us as sort of the emerging industries, like we're in that cusp between startup as well as sort of mains, like larger corporates, right? So we're in that very interesting space today. So I think input costs, I think we've all discussed at length, and I think there is certainly an expectation and a hope from the government in terms of tax rationalization. I want to talk on a bit of a different topic, just from an industry perspective, right? I think one thing that we're really hoping from the government, and I think just last year, right, we've seen some amazing traction in the Indian startup ecosystem, right? We've seen companies go public. We've seen venture
Yeah.
capital come at unprecedented levels, right? Look, talking about $63 billion coming into the Indian economy from venture capital funds, right? And I think the other really interesting space we are in today as an industry, fledgling industry, is that for the first time, I think international investors are now choosing to invest in Indian startups versus China-based startups, right? Because there is a big belief in terms of the stability, the growth story, the quality of the entrepreneurs and the teams that are, and the entire story there, right? What I'm actually really excited about in hearing in this budget is, I think, around themes around how are we looking at taxing capital gains, right? As an unlisted company in India,
Yeah.
right, you're looking at pretty much like a double the capital gains tax that you would pay for a listed company, right? And this is the segment that needs the most impetus and the most boost, right? I mean, we had a conversation, I think, we've been having conversations the last 2 years about the angel tax regime, right? And I think a lot of
Yeah,
movement and good movement has been made on that front, but I
certainly.
think there are still very strong and I think very tough criteria to meet to become an angel investor, to make use of the benefits that have been created by the government, right? So I think these, if we just look at sort of, one piece, of course, is how, and I think every panelist has talked about it, right? The input cost, the increasing jobs, etc. But I think the other piece is, how do you sort of really spur the story of innovation? How do you really spur the story of startups in India? How do you make it even more mainstream? The narrative now is now coming mainstream because of Shark Tank and all the other plays, right? But how do you ensure that capital makes it a lot more mainstream and it becomes a lot easier for people to actually invest in India, to grow Indian startups, and to actually ensure that India becomes the destination for startups, and for investing in startups very, very definitively. We have this opportunity before us. We are now becoming the place of choice versus India, versus China. How do we really consolidate on that?
Absolutely. I mean, we have become unicorn land. And as you mentioned, thanks to Shark Tank India, I think more people have been talking about D2C than ever before, right? So that's one good thing that Shark Tank has done for us. And like you said, the market is flush with capital. This much we know for sure. And investors are very bullish on the India story also is a fact. But then again, just just when it comes to executing their being able to invest as, much or as freely they would like, the processes perhaps are a little bit too cumbersome even now. You spoke about the angel tax. This is an issue which goes back, I believe, over 3 years or so, that we first started, the DPIITs, started to hear the DPIIT talk about the angel tax. And there were concerns about how the government views
I think we've lost Alicia's voice.
Yes.
I'm sorry. I'm not sure at what point I became inaudible.
On the angel taxation.
Well, absolutely. So, the question I was asking you really, Naya, was that can you suggest, or to your mind, what can be some of the things that can be done to really foster the spirit of innovation? Innovation R&D, we know are critical, in some other sectors as well. When we talk about chemicals, when we talk about, emerging tech like EVs now, but that is also the case, in the FMCG and consumer space. So, how can these programs that the government already runs be strengthened further? And do we need an institutional sort of framework, or a better framework, to make it reach more people?
Absolutely. So I think, if you remember, I think about a year and a half back, the government had announced a startup funds, right? I think, so there is, absolutely, I think there is, certainly a lot of narrative that's happening around how the government is, wants to support startups across India. There is certainly fund allocation happening. I think the open question is, how does that, first of all, of course, the money get deployed. Number two, how are we sort of mainstreaming entrepreneurship in India, right? And I think while we have, pockets of innovation, I think, Bombay, Gurgaon, Mumbai, Delhi, Bangalore,
Absolutely, yeah.
play out, Hyderabad play out. I think that the real story of entrepreneurship is when it basically reaches, a tier 2, tier 3, as well as rural India, right? I think that story is something I'm excited about seeing. What does the government have in mind for actually mainstreaming entrepreneurship across these regions. I think the third piece is, of course, across manufacturing, right? As you think about, manufacturing in India, I think it is still, there's still, I think, a very, very, it's still something that needs a lot more support from the government. I want to channel back to one of the, schemes the government had a long time back. I'm not sure how well it was executed, but the special economic zones, right, for exports.
Yeah.
Now, can we have something akin to that, but for manufacturing? And can this be set up in maybe tier 2, tier 3, or in areas which need that impetus, need that fund inflow? And how can those benefits then therefore translate to the rest of us who are basically trying to source from these manufacturers at scale, right? I think this we've all learned. I think at D2C, we've all learned not to rely on China for supplies. I
Yeah.
think
Absolutely.
we've all learned to look inwards. We're looking in India, we're looking at manufacturers, we're looking at raw materials, everything from India. And the great thing is, as I mentioned at the beginning of the conversation, this sentiment of make in India, make for India is very strong. So the consumers are basically also supporting this shift in approach, right? I think now we are looking at how can the government ensure that this becomes a feasible financial reality for us, and we're excited about seeing this play out in the budget.
Absolutely. I think you're bang on with that. There's very strong, traction and sort of, enthusiasm that, we see play out when we talk about Make in India, but just how feasible it is at this point in time, for players who are starting out. And, how much more feasible that can be made, is something that the government should perhaps look to address as well. So, before I close this conversation, I think I want to go back to the sentiment question once again. We have discussed the challenges and what the remedies to that could be. Input cost inflation, not enough jobs. Our points, I believe, as a panel that we have recognized are something that would need to be addressed. And of course, just perhaps a better regulatory framework for the various sectors that FMCG, subsectors that FMCG players operate in. But now, coming to you, Neeta, how do you address the sentiment question? How do you ensure that, given all the uncertainties we find ourselves in, and for the foreseeable future, perhaps we would continue to find ourselves in, one way to mitigate them, according to the government, not just in India, but also globally, is to try and keep people indoors, which doesn't help the sector that you operate in. What you said that home deliveries perhaps or some legislation around that might help, but the larger question around how do you really spur spending when there isn't much to really celebrate, given that we have one COVID wave after another and compounded over a period of time that's the last 2 years, that does do something when it comes to the whole whether it's festivals. So all of that spirit has been dimmed a little bit. But how do you ensure that that's resilient and stays with us?
So I will, I think consumption will come back. I think India during its festival periods will, and usually the second half of the year, you will see that coming back. I think if I was to just kind of cut the chase and say what is one single-minded focus that is required at this point of time is really job creation. Right? And job creation through infrastructure efforts, job creation through Manrega, job creations, everything that essentially puts that extra 100 rupees in the wallet of the bottom of the pyramid. That is the most important point that I would say. Second is, in addition to that, because I think consumption also needs to come with responsibility and values. And therefore, I always come back and see, where are the women? Where are the women being educated? What is the women, safety net here? What are the women percentages in employment? So that's another thing that I always point a finger at, to say women have dropped in COVID years, right? I mean, today we are back to when I started my career. So that's sub 11%. I think we are 8% participation. And that doesn't work for any growth-oriented society. The third is education. When you are talking about rural sector, or even you're talking about the urban tier 1, tier 2, education is the sector that suffered the most. This generation has lost what, 2 years? The younger
Yeah.
generation, 2 years of its education. It's not coming back. So these would be the three areas where I would look forward to the government to say that, don't rely on subsidies. Forget giving subsidies to industries. Forget it for a moment. But try
Yeah.
and pay attention to
Yeah.
try and fuel that spirit that you spoke about, which was to do with education, job creation, and women participation.
Absolutely. I think that's a very holistic set of recommendations that you have spoken about here. And for people to spend, it's important that they actually have something to spend. So I believe that that's a critical, pillar that the government should look to address. The same question to you, Nilaya. How do you address sentiment at this point in time? And, in general, the times that we have been seeing and will likely continue to see.
Yeah. So, Arisha, first for sentiments, I think on 1st February we shouldn't look at the stock market. I think we should. I,
Well, that is not happening.
but we should really be looking at the money that the government is allocating towards capital expenditure, because that's really the key to getting out of this. End of the day, I've always said budget is also a reflection of political reality. We do have elections. We not just in March, but we also have elections later in the year. So I do believe, therefore, I'm very hopeful that it's going to drive consumption, because that's extremely
Right.
important. Doing it, but I do believe two other points. One, I think we spoke about e-commerce and just the whole framework that has been coming. I do believe we should not create too much differentiation between offline and
Right.
online,
Yeah.
because that can kill the growth that is happening. And I often recommend government should be looking from a consumer's perspective, not from a supplier's perspective. The day you start looking at policy from a consumer perspective, it really doesn't matter about offline and online. Now, if somebody does get impacted in the way the economy and the world is going, you need to provide safety net for those people, but not at the cost of consumer. So I think that's something that is very, very important. And finally, I do believe this government is very keen, uh, Naya, you spoke about it. I think India has huge knowledge about its own. It's actually a culture, right? It's not India, and how in health and wellness, which has seen so much of more product
Yeah.
development. How can we bring in the Indian knowledge and grow that market, not just in India, but outside of India, wherein a large number of small and medium companies can participate and much larger job creation can happen. I think those are some of the things that I would talk about.
No, absolutely, and you're also right to point out that when we talk about investing in startups or startup ideas, even we don't often go back to the wisdom or the sciences we have in our own country. We're always looking for a very westward, in a very westward sort of manner when we talk about our own industries as well. And hopefully there is more impetus on developing some of our wisdom and the sciences that we have in the country. Naya, what would you like to add to that? You control a space, you operate in the content space, so you actually have massive reach with your audiences. You can actually influence them in a way. And I believe one of your executives, your CMO, was talking about uninterrupted advertising. That's one way to look at content also. How can that how can we ensure that the bottom the bottom levels of India's population pyramid are feeling good so that they want to spend more?
Okay, so I think there are two pieces to this, right, Alicia? I think the first piece is around for people to feel good. I mean, of course, they need to be consuming, content that makes them feel good. That content needs to reach them. and how do you sort of close that loop of feeling good by getting the products, right? And those products need to be affordable, need to be, available to you. You need to know why you want to buy those products. You have the money to buy those products, right? I think, just stepping back, when you look at the startup and the venture ecosystem in India, right? Many times I think, and I say this for some of the folks who've been here for the last decade building out in India, right? They're actually creating the pipes in many ways for Indian, awareness as well as access to products to exist. I mean, I'm just going to talk about delivery for a minute here, right? I mean, that's a plug and play for most D2C brands today, right? They have actually built out the last mile logistics for so many of us, right? Express Bees recently, a unicorn. Again, I think similar story on logistics, right? So, I mean, broadly, what I would say is it doesn't like, I mean, I think consumer sentiment, you can keep positive, but I mean, if you create a lot of pent up demand that you don't service, right, that can create a lot of frustration, right? So I think just sort of stepping back, what does this mean for us? How can the government, I mean, I think I'm really excited about reading more about how the government in this budget will make it easier for startups and ventures to scale across India. I'm emphasizing this one more time. It's a defining
Yeah.
moment for India, right? This is a moment where people are preferring investing in us versus China, right? How do you create an enabling regime that supports companies being invested in India by international investors, by domestic investors, a lot of capital in domestic investors as well that is not being leveraged to create wealth back in the economy? And how do you also support the infrastructure for companies who are now emerging to go public and create wealth for retail investors?
Yeah.
Right, because now if you look at the Indian ecosystem, you finally have stories at scale of companies going public in India, right?
Sure.
I think this enabling ecosystem, and I think a narrative around that and a regime and and incentives around that is what I'm really looking forward to hearing in this budget.
Well, it's great to have your perspective, from the startup ecosystem here. And, we can hopefully look forward to more investable businesses coming out of India, and then for investors to find it easier also to invest in India and list in India eventually, like you mentioned. Um, Kunal, the same question to you. The sentiment piece, you have been
Yeah.
operating in the food space. That is a big market for India. It will continue to be thanks to our sheer size. Um, what can the government do, to
Yeah.
propel consumption across
Yeah.
all the segments of
Absolutely.
the population that we have in our country?
Yeah. Look, the fact of the matter, Alicia, is that, as you said, people are spending large amount of time indoors. Now, what are they really doing indoors? There's this whole usage of mobile phones, the usage of e-commerce platforms, and I say this that to drive sentiment, it's not only the role of the government, but the FMCG players can play a big role. The e-commerce players have to play a big role. So the challenge, or therefore the opportunity, is that how do the FMCG players partner with e-commerce players, understanding and developing, and of course taking the help of the government, developing digital infrastructure, making the interface available in multiple languages, using voice-based search mechanism to drive and deliver algorithms that help in giving the product choices to the consumers while they're sitting at home. You mentioned about the science of India. India is known for its Ayurveda and all the other sciences, but today neither people have the time nor the willingness to do the same formulations at home. What are the FMCG players,
Yeah.
doing to provide that convenience at the tip of their fingertips? So people want to use that. They understand. They've been hearing about these remedies from their grandmothers and mothers, but they don't want to make it. They don't want to do it. Similarly, food and grocery. They're not going out. They don't want to go to outside, and expose themselves to the virus. But they need that delivery to happen at home on their doorstep. So I say that the government has to look into investment not only in infrastructure but digital infrastructure, investment in terms of what kind of ecosystem, the last mile deliveries. Cool chain is a big challenge.
Absolutely.
I've spent a lot of years in the chocolate space, and one of the challenges that we used to face was the cool chain delivery. It's not that the rural consumer doesn't want a chocolate, but how do you ensure that the rural consumer gets chocolate that's not old, that's not expired, and that actually gives the true chocolate experience? This is where the government can come in and play a role. The warehousing, the cool chain, the logistics, these are things that help in ensuring that goods come back into the house and the sentiment gets driven. Because how does the sentiment of any human being really get driven? You need to feel good, and you feel good when either you're getting what you want and you don't have to really stress for that because everything is available to you easily. I think these are really the things how the government can play a role in this. And I also say this, that we talk a lot about monetary benefits, but let's not forget that the more the digital rises, the more it brings rise to cyber attack possibilities as well. So also from a budget point of view, there is a need in
Yeah.
terms of thinking and putting the investment in cybersecurity laws, in understanding those policies. I'm sitting here in Switzerland. Cryptocurrency is a reality. You cannot walk away from that. You can love it, you can hate it. It is getting accepted more and more in different industries. Now, again, it is for the government to say that we are going to put aside a certain amount in the budget and start understanding this a bit better. We will work with the players rather than stopping them. Let's understand from them and start bringing these frameworks in place so that whether we want to use that or not in the right legitimate way, we can make it possible. So I think there are many different ways. We often talk about government and budget, and we talk about stimulus and fiscal benefits, but I think there are other levers which the government can use to drive consumption and to bring in that positive sentiment. That would be my way of looking at this thing.
Well, thank you for that, Kunal. And I'm extremely glad that this panel had, a lot of focus on non-fiscal incentives as well. And I think policymakers are always happy to hear that as well. The less, fiscal stimulus you demand from the government, the better. Thank you so much, ladies and gentlemen, for joining us for this panel discussion today. Great insights. And I hope our viewers were also able to, take back some of these insights. It's a very disruptive space. Nilaya, Kunal, Neeta, thank you so much for taking your time and
Lovely to
speaking
talk
to us
you.
today.
Thank
Pleasure.
you.
Thank you. Have a
Pleasure.
great rest of the day, you all. Thanks.